Welcome back to Let's Make a Game, a channel about making computer role-playing games using the free program Twine and the SugarCube format for Twine. In this video, I would like to continue my series on converting the board game Source of the Nile to a Twine game, which we are calling Into the Unknown. And specifically, I would like to talk about how missionaries and doctors interact with settlements. So, as you can see here, I've started an expedition. We've gotten into a fight. We've been taken prisoner. And all of that is stuff that we've already discussed and explained how that works. But there's some new stuff here as well. We can see we have a missionary and a doctor in the expedition, and we can see that the missionary attempts to convert the locals, and unfortunately for him, he was ignored, and also that the doctor attempts to treat the locals and successfully treats some minor cases. So this is what will happen every time you go into a settlement, either because you were captured or because you've sort of established friendly-ish relations with them, and you have a doctor and or a missionary. The missionary will attempt to convert them, and the doctor will attempt to treat them, and in both cases it's a simple matter of a die roll on a table. So let's start by looking at the rules that we're converting. I will look at the tables in the original rules. So we have the two tables here, the missionary table and the doctor table, and you can see that for each or for both of them, it's a simple die roll. There aren't any modifiers. This game doesn't use sort of character stats. You might think, oh, the missionary's charisma or something ought to be, the missionary ought to have a charisma or a zeal or something, and that ought to affect what happens. But, well, in this game, it's just roll a die and see what happens. So for each result, there's a message. So natives jeer and taunt, natives ignore missionary, doctor become sick, doctor fails to halt epidemic, etc., etc. Then, generally, you have an effect on attitude, and often you have some victory points, and sometimes you have that particular people try to poison the missionary, and those are the main effects. There's a couple of other ones as well, but so attitude. Let's go through them one by one. Attitude. Each group of locals has an attitude number. The attitude number starts at 0. It goes up or down based on circumstance, and it is a modifier to if you meet those locals again. A positive number means that they're more likely to be friendly to you, and a negative number means that they are more likely to be hostile to you. So attitude +2 means that next time you meet these particular group of locals, i.e. if you meet them when you're coming back, they'll be more likely to be friendly to you. VP is victory points. I should say that we're generally treating one VP in the rules as 10 VP. So for this result, instead of +1 VP, you'd actually get +10 VP. We've discussed the reasons why in the previous video, but it's mostly because we're dealing with each mile as a separate increment rather than dealing with quite large spaces. And so we need to sort of reduce the number of points you get for mapping new territory. So we've increased all the others by a factor of 10. So that's attitude and victory points. So what does it mean when someone tries to poison the character? Well, fairly straightforward. You roll 2 dice. It says 2 die here, but that's obviously a mistake. You roll 2 dice. You select one roll. Well, you take the higher one, and then you consult this table. And a 1 or 2 means that you're poisoned and die. 3 means you're poisoned but recovers, and 4 to 6 means the attempt fails. But there's no mechanical difference between 3 and 4 and 6. It's just a flavour difference. So the practical thing is that if you get a 1 or a 2 on both dice, then you're poisoned and die. And that works out to a 1 in 9 chance of dying. The other thing, it doesn't say this on the table, but it says it in a nearby rule. Every time you change the attitude, that will also be a modifier to your attempts to escape. So we'll have a variable which is the escape modifier, which will change based on these results. That will be relevant to when you've been captured. Obviously, it's not relevant to when you're peacefully interacting. The only other two results are that if you're a doctor and you roll a 1, you die straight away. You get a strange disease and you die. And if you roll a 2, you become sick, which we've already dealt with how sickness works. The doctor table is a lot more brutal. You always either die or get sick, or there's an attempt to poison you, and you're much less likely to get points or change their attitude. I assume that that's because the doctor has advantages that the missionary doesn't have, like the doctor, if other characters are sick and you have a doctor, that makes it more likely that the other characters will recover. So I assume that this table is more brutal to sort of compensate for that. As always, of course, when we have the full game programmed and we're testing it, we might decide that this is a little bit too brutal and we'll change it. But for now, that's what we're doing. All right. So having looked at what we're trying to encode, let's look at how we did that. So first of all, I need to show you some variables. So some new variables. So we have ES, which is the modifier to escape rolls. We have PR, which is the results of preaching, and we have TR, which is the results of treating. These are the major new roles that we'll be dealing with, and they are set out in exactly the same way. They're both two-dimensional array, and they use the same format. So let's have a look at PR first. So we set PR equals square bracket, which is just how we start an array. And then for each slot of the array, we make that an array. And that's how we set up a two-dimensional array. And each of these arrays has the same things in the same order. Firstly, it has a message. So in this case, they listen respectfully, or they ignore you, they jeer and taunt, etc., etc. Then we have 3 numbers. The first number is the effect on attitude and on $ES. Attitude is stored in the variable IA. We have talked about that before. We haven't sort of dealt with it very much, so I'll just reiterate that. So $IA10, for example, is the attitude of the locals who are 10 miles inland. It's by... I've actually made a mistake in that I've said that IAZ is the attitude of the locals I miles inland. Well, of course, it meant Z miles inland. Anyway, so IA, I guess, stands for inland attitude. I'm not sure. So back to PR. So we have the highlight one of these. We have the message. We have the effect on attitude and on ES. The next number is the number of victory points, and the final number is the number of attempted poisonings, which are usually 0, but might be 1 or 2. And then for the doctor, we have exactly the same thing. Message, effect on attitude, number of victory points, number of attempted poisonings. Now, there is an extra effect for the doctor, which is that if they roll a 1, they die, and if they roll a 2, they become sick, but that's not in this array. It's just dealt with as in the code because it was easy to do it that way. So let's have a look at where we've encoded this. So the format that I've laid this out, I don't know if it's a good format. I've sort of been adding things as I go, of course. I didn't have an initial plan for what it was going to look like, but what I've done is the main there's a sort of horizontal row which is kind of the main, it's setting up and then it's the main sequence of the turn. So it's deciding how fast you're going to go. Sorry, clicked the wrong thing. Deciding how fast you're going to go, checking movement points, hunting, seeing if you're starving or sick, etc., and rolling for a discovery, which we haven't yet done. And then I've got things that interrupt that sequence sort of off, below, or above. So, for example, foot, this is meant to be when you are having trouble proceeding. So that sort of interrupts the turn. And then meeting locals is a sort of very large side procedure. And so that's how I've conceived of it. This is sort of the main line of the turn, and then things that are off to one side or above it or below it are sort of interruptions to that turn. So I've got this quite large set of stuff down here, which is all the stuff to do with interacting with people, because of course there's a lot of different things that can happen when you're interacting with people. So we start with the page after defeat. So some of these are new. This one and this one, actually, sorry, this one, and this one you won't have seen already, but some of these I'll just reiterate what they do. So after defeat, this is, you've lost a battle. We add 20 victory points if we have a journalist, because that's what the rules say. Then we have this thing that says we have to roll to see what happens as a result of the defeat, and it says if random 1 to 1 is equal to 1, then your enemies take you prisoner, and we include the page prisoner. Well, random 1, 1 just means a random number from 1 to 1, which means it will always generate a 1. And so random 1, 1 will always be equal to 1. So all this stuff will never happen. So what's going on here? Well, what's going on here is this should be random 1 to 6, but I have changed it so that when you lose a battle, you always get captured. And the reason I've done that is because if I didn't do that, it would take sort of 100 goes to get to the part of the game that I wanted to show you, right? So that's just a temporary thing to make sure that the thing I want to come up comes up in a reasonable amount of time. Normally, it will be 1 to 6. Okay, so if we roll a 1 on this roll, then we get taken prisoner and we go to prisoner, which is what we're dealing with today. In prisoner, we set... Actually, sorry, I was wrong. I told you that this one, and this one are new. This one is also new. Okay, so this is a very short page, you'll notice. We set ES equal to 0. That's the modifier for escape attempts. And then we say, if $P6 is equal to 1 and $S6 is equal to 0 and $IPI is not equal to 1, then we do these two things. We set IPI equal to 1 and we include preach. And having dealt with that, we then go to prisoner 2. So what does all this mean? If P6 is equal to 1, $P is the array that tells you what specialists are present, and $P6 is specifically if there's a missionary. So if $P6 equals 1 or is equal to 1 just means if there's a missionary in the expedition. And $S6 is equal to 0. $S is the array that deals with the health of people in the expedition. And $S6 deals with the health of the missionary. And if $S6 equals 0, it means that the missionary is healthy. They're not sick and they're not recovering, which is a state you can be in if you're sick but you roll fairly well. You're not quite better, but you're getting better. So if you have a healthy missionary and $IP$I is not equal to 1. Well, this is a new variable, which I cunningly forgot to show you, so I'm sorry about that. I should have done that at the beginning. The rule says that a missionary can only try and convert a given bunch of locals once. And the reason for that, I suspect, is because if that rule wasn't the case, the missionary could just sit there in one village sort of preaching again and again and getting victory points without any danger. So I assume that they've said, no, one go per missionary. I think there's better ways to do that. I think you could set it up so that you can try to convert them until they're fully converted, and then you have to move on. But that would require, more rules, and that's something we'll look at in the future. But for now, we're doing rules as written. You can only try and convert each group once, and because that's the rule, we need some variable to keep track of that, and we use $IP. So $IP10, for example, will be set to 1 if a missionary has tried to convert the locals 10 miles inland. And a doctor can only try to treat the locals. They can only try and treat each group of locals once. And again, we have an array which is IT, and that is the equivalent. It's set to 1 if you've tried to treat the locals in that area. Then that slot of IT is set to 1, so you can't do it again. I should also say that I've slightly changed the $S array, the array that deals with sickness. I've set it up so that it starts with all of the variables, all of the slots set to 0, rather than being undefined. In some programming languages, a variable is initially sort of set to 0. It's assumed to be 0. But in this, it's assumed to be undefined, and undefined is different to 0. So if I hadn't done this, if I hadn't had this for array setting all of these slots to 0, sorry, doesn't want to move. Hang on. There we go. If I hadn't done that, then this would be false most of the time, because it would say, is S6 0? No, S6 is undefined. Well, that's not 0, that's a different thing. And so you wouldn't be able to preach, and that's not the desired result. So, if you have a missionary, if the missionary is healthy, and if the missionary hasn't tried to convert this particular group of locals, then we set IPI equal to 1 so that we can't try again, and we include the page preach. So why do we include the page preach? Why don't we just put the code that's in preach in here? And the answer to that is because you can try to convert the locals after being captured, but you can also do it when you're trading peacefully with them. So there's 2 different places, only one of which has been coded so far, but there's going to be 2 different places where this code will be necessary. And so therefore we put it in a separate page and we refer to it in an include, because otherwise we'd have to sort of type out the code twice, which would be ridiculous. So let's look at preach. Preach is fairly straightforward. There's a little note to myself that says that changes to ES are only relevant in captivity. So it just says the missionary attempts to convert the locals. We generate a random number from 1 to 6. We have a message in red to let the player know what was rolled. The fact that it's in red tells us that it's intended that we're going to get rid of it in the full game, and that it's just for testing. That's my little sort of code for myself. Anything that comes up in red is not meant to be there in the final game. And then we print $PRZ0, because that's the message part of that array. We set IAI, which is the IA being the attitude array, and $I being how far inland we are. We set that one equal to itself plus PRZ1, because that's the adjustment to attitude. We set ES equal to ES plus PRZ1, because that changes by the same number. We set VP, which is our victory points, equal to VP plus PRZ2. Then we deal with poisonings. We set Y equal to 0. Y is a flag that's going to be set to 1 if the character is poisoned. We have a for loop. The for loop goes from 1 to PRZ3, which is the number of poisoning attempts. PRZ3 is usually 0. So usually what will happen is it'll look at this, it'll say for x equals 1, right? I'll set x to 1. this executes as long as x is less than or equal to PRZ3. Well, x is 1 and PRZ3 is 0, so this isn't true, so I'm not going to execute this at all. So you can have a for loop that executes 0 times. When it initially looks at this, it says no, and doesn't do it. And in fact, usually that's what will happen. And then, of course, it increases by 1 at the end. But if there are any poisonings, then it'll go through it 1 or 2 times, depending on what's in here. And it simply says if random 1 to 9 is equal to 1, then set y equals 1. And then, after those poisonings, or usually having skipped the for loop, if y is equal to 1, then it says a jealous believer poisons the missionary, and we set P6 equal to 0. They are dead. You might think thematically that should get you quite a lot of victory points. Like it seems like, from what I know of kind of Victorian culture, you'd think having a missionary that went to preach to the natives and then the ungrateful bastards poisoned him and he became a martyr, that would be something that would give him a really high status back home. But the rules don't say so. That's something I might add later. Of course, in the original game, because you don't bring these people along, you yourself, the player character, is the missionary. If you die, of course, that's the end of your game. So why give you victory points, I suppose? But anyway, that's a possible future thing that you get victory points for being martyred. But anyway, so remembering that prisoner, once we've dealt with preach, goes to prisoner 2. Prisoner 2, I could have put prisoner and prisoner 2 into one bit of code. I could have put the code that was in here just at the end here, but it's just a bit easier to look at the flow, to have them as separate ones. And this is basically the same. If P2 is equal to 1, so instead of 6, we're looking at 2, being that's the doctor, of course. And S2 is equal to 0, and $ITI is not equal to 1. So IT is the array that deals with the fact that you have only one go at treating any given group of locals. If all those things are true, if you have a doctor, the doctor's fit and well, and you haven't yet tried to treat the locals, then we set ITI equal to 1, and we include treat. And then once we've done that, we go to prisoner 3. Prisoner 3 is as yet blank, but it will be where the escape is dealt with. Treat is basically the same as preach, with some of the variables being different. We set z equal to random to 1 to 6. We have a slightly different message. We have the message in red of what we rolled. So we're dealing with TR instead of PR. So we print the message, we adjust IA, we adjust ES, we adjust VP. That's exactly the same. The only difference comes down here, because if you roll a 1, you're dead. So if z equals 1, and that's not in the array, that's not something that's stored in the array, it's an extra thing. So if z equals 1, we set P2 equal to 0, and if z equals 2, we set S2 equal to 1, which means that the doctor is now sick. And if neither of those things are true, then we do the same thing we've done with the poisoning flag. And the reason we do that is because in these two, if we rolled a 1 or a 2, there's no chance of being poisoned. So we can put that in the else part of the code. We set y equals to 0. We have a for loop that involves a 1 in 9 chance of y being set to 1, and then if y is indeed equal to 1, we get a slightly different message. A fearful local poisons the doctor. Again, you might think that should get you victory points. Victorians loved a bold doctor who went to treat the savages, and then the savages ungratefully, poisoned him. But the rules as written say that you don't get victory points for being martyred. But so again, we might think about that. But that is how it currently works. And because we've got preach and treat as separate pages, when we deal with peacefully interacting with the natives, we can call upon them again. And so that is how That is how preaching and treating the sick works. What I'll probably do next, I might deal with trying to escape, or I might start dealing with peaceful interactions with the natives. I haven't yet decided yet. But for now, I hope that was useful or interesting to at least some of you, and I hope you will tune in next time.